Part of this session is also to introduce the issues around repair in the agricultural machinery aftermarket. So we have two speakers. We have Frank Scartamalia, who's a manager from cane growers in the Herbert River in Queensland, and I invite Frank to come down to join us here. And also we have Mark Swift, who's a former Nuffield scholar, but also a mixed cropping farmer from Parkes in New South Wales, and Mark is going to join us here. Just to give you some background and context, in 2021, the ACCC, our competition authority, concluded its agricultural machinery aftermarket inquiry. This was a detailed inquiry conducted by our competition authority, and one of the key findings of that inquiry was that there was restricted access to software tools, technical information and service manuals and parts held by manufacturers, which were limiting competition in repair markets. It also finds that warranties can limit competition by discouraging the use of independent repairers. ACCC Deputy Chair Mick Keogh, the former executive from the Australian Farm Institute, said competition in after-sales markets would be improved if independent repairers had access to software tools and parts on fair and reasonable commercial terms. This is an important issue that runs across a number of industries, both in Australia and overseas. The ACCC concluded in its final report that agricultural machinery be considered for future inclusion in the motor vehicle service and repair information sharing scheme, which we just heard about from Leslie. In 2021, we know that the Australian Productivity Commission conducted its right to repair inquiry. The Productivity Commission in its final report also recognised that harm from restrictions on repair supplies was most evident and acute for agricultural machinery. Timely repairs are critical for farmers and other owners of agricultural machinery, particularly during harvest periods when downed equipment can result in thousands of dollars in lost production. Undertaking self-repair or using the local independent repairer is therefore often the preferred option. Our National Farmers Federation also supports the introduction of a right to repair. In their submission to the Productivity Commission, they stated they continue to seek a proactive right to repair for agricultural machinery through either the expansion of the consumer guarantees under the Australian Consumer Law or through a right to repair law similar to the Automotive Data Sharing Scheme. Recommendation 8.2 of the Productivity Commission final report recommended that there be a repair supplies obligation on agricultural machinery. The Australian Government should introduce a repair supplies obligation on agricultural machinery that requires manufacturers to provide access to repair information and diagnostic software tools to the machinery owners and independent repairers on fair and reasonable commercial terms. Design of the scheme should commence by the end of 2022, and to inform scheme design and implementation, the Australian Government should monitor developments in the motor vehicle sharing and service and repair information sharing scheme, as well as voluntary information sharing within the agricultural machinery industry to determine the scope of the information that should be included, and also consider whether this obligation should be implemented through an extension of the motor vehicle scheme. This scheme should be evaluated after it has been in operation for 3 years to assess the effectiveness and determine whether any changes are required, including extending the scheme to cover spare parts. To reinforce some of those points that have been made both by the ACCC and the Productivity Commission, I've invited Frank and Mark to share some of their experiences around what the inability to repair agricultural machinery has meant for them and their businesses. Frank, can I ask you to come up here? Would you like to speak up here? Yeah.
Thanks, Leanne. So I travelled down from North Queensland. It's fairly much hotter than down here. It's about 27, 28 degrees. So I've got a jumper on. I'm the manager of Cane Growers Herbert River, and I represent around about 480 cane growers who own their own farm businesses and cane growing farms. They all obviously require to purchase tractors to plant, to work their ground, a tractor these days, you're looking at a brand new tractor of around about 250,000 to 270,000 per tractor without even adding on the implements that you need to use. So that's tractors wise, and then there's around about 50 harvester contractors in our district, and they all have their own harvester, sugarcane harvester. So sugarcane harvesters up to $1 million. Most brand new John Deere Case, they're close to $1 million, if not $1 million. But also adding to that cane harvester, you also need 3 tractors to haul out the cane to a siding where you deliver it, where the train picks it up. So then, you're nearly up to $2 million just to, so obviously your return on investment's pretty big. So you'd think with spending $2 million, you'd have access to data, access to software to be able to diagnose or to fix or repair your tractor. A few examples that I've seen, and if you call out the dealership, who's the only one that has access to those software that the manufacturer gives access to, you're looking at around about $130 to $160 an hour. That's just to come out there and start working on it, plus a call-out fee. If that was on a Sunday, and obviously these farmers, they operate 7 days a week, and you only have a window, a 6-month window in the harvester period, so you want to get the job done. You don't want any downtime. But on a Sunday, you're looking at anywhere from $260 an hour to $300 plus an hour. So it's pretty exuberant. When they go to use their independent repairers, they're anything from $80 to $100 an hour, and they don't charge extra for Saturday or Sunday, and they don't charge a call-out fee, so it's quite reasonable. So you do your maths, and they would prefer to use the independent repairer, but the problem is the independent repairer can only repair 1 out of 10 issues. So they're usually the minor issues. 9 out of 10 they cannot repair, and they've got to call the dealer anyway, the authorised dealer. So that's the challenge. And I suppose a couple of examples I wanted to share. So I was just speaking to a farmer the other day, because I wanted real life examples. There's a valve stack on the back of the tractor, and that's what you plug your hydraulic hoses to, and there's a control and so on. If you had to buy the genuine parts, they're $5,000 each valve. So the whole stack, being a 5-stack, is $25,000. A non-genuine part, which is a high-quality valve stack, is only $1,500 per valve, so $7,500. It's a huge difference. And you'd say, well, why don't you go buy the $7,500 stack? Well, you can't, because it's not compatible with that machine. So the manufacturers have made their parts so that only you can plug in that genuine part. So it quarantines you going to that manufacturer. And to exacerbate that more, they've also tagged on that if you purchase this part, you can get 12-month warranty. But you can only get that 12-month warranty if you use the authorised dealer to install that part. So they're just trying with all these catches. And I was speaking to Leslie earlier about warranties and, the misperceptions around warranties, and that they really can't do that. But the growers, the farmers, the contractors, they have the dealer telling them this is what it is, and this is what the manufacturers told them, and they're just passing that on. So there's all that misperception happening out in the market too. Another example is, so another farmer, he'd transported his tractor on a float to his home farm to do some work there. And when they transport it, these are all fairly new tractors, they went to get on the tractor and reverse it off the float. But the seat, it's an active seat, so it collapsed to the bottom. So they couldn't do much with it. So an active seat is, how that works is if you're going over bumps, or it actually is able to sense going over the bumps, ups and downs, and tries to make the ride as comfortable as possible for the operator. Well, because that had collapsed, they couldn't operate the tractor. But one of his workers used to be a technician from the authorised dealer, so he went and had a look at it. But he couldn't do anything either because he didn't have the computer because he wasn't with the authorised dealer anymore. So they still had to contact the authorised dealer to come out with the computer to diagnose what's going on and how to fix it. So if they had to replace that chair, it's a minimum $10,000 just for a chair, plus installation. You know, so these are the kind of, I suppose, a couple of examples of what the farmers are facing in that regard, and really just corralling them to only deal with the authorised dealer. A bit of a challenge in that sense. So I suppose, you know, reiterating what the Minister was speaking about in the sense of competition, you know, we really do need to enhance the right to repair in the agricultural space, because it's going to eliminate the quarantining of just being able to use authorised dealers, but then expand to be competitive amongst independent repairers, so then they can access them at any time and every day without having to think about how much is this going to hurt my hip pocket and be unviable for my business. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. It's actually great to hear some insights from the Australian sugar industry. I know you've got your challenges. I'd now like to invite Mark Swift to speak. Mark is a mixed farmer from Parkes, New South Wales. Sorry. Mixed cropping, sorry.
You're right. Yes, so I'm from the other Parkes, not this Parkes that we're presently sitting in. Yeah, look, my name is Mark Swift. I'm a farmer from Parkes in central New South Wales. I farm with my wife's family. We're a specialist cropping enterprise. I would like to suggest that we operate in one of the most volatile environments for cropping anywhere on the planet, and I have a little bit of authority to talk about that. I have been a Nuffield Scholar, as was mentioned earlier. That's given me the very good fortune to travel the world looking at agriculture, and I was looking at the topics that are not dissimilar to this. So the reason I'm here today is I'm going to be quite brief because I would appreciate a few questions from the floor if we get the chance, is to really lay out the importance of timeliness to our business and how that intersects with the ability to keep our machines operating at critical times. So the first thing I want to leave you with is, or share with you, is that success in agriculture is a function of timing. Timing is a function of logistics, and logistics, according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is the ability to handle the details of an operation. So if we compress that down, success in agriculture is about handling the details. So I'm going to share with you some important points about where our profit margins come from in agriculture and how brief the windows are for us to catch them. So people would really appreciate, people like to talk in averages. We can understand that, they're easy to digest. People want to talk about the average rainfall I get in my climate, and it's 550 mils, and it's basically a flat, evenly distributed throughout the year. It's a real agricultural utopia in average. It bears absolutely no resemblance to my lived experience in that environment. So we operate, for the last 20 years, we've been 1 in 5 years in the desert, 1 in 3 years we're in the high rainfall zone, and about 50% of the time we're in between. The reason that that matters is that it compresses our profit opportunities to a very small number of years. So we're probably losing a substantial amount of money in those desert years, and we're trying to figure out how to minimise that. The in-between years are operating with pretty slim margins, but those 1 in 3 where we're in the high rainfall zone, that's where all our profits come from. That's where we make our opportunities. The really challenging part about that is that those wet years, 80% of them also have wet harvests. So that means that we've got the highest profit potential, but we've also got the highest potential for loss. So to give an example, a former example that we've lived through and the impact of that was 2010. We've just come off the back end of the Millennium Drought, or the Noughties Drought as I would like to describe it, and we've had 4 drought-affected crops, and we've come into 2020. We've just got a magnificent crop in front of us. We're right on the cusp of harvest, just starting out. The only wrinkle is that the Bureau of Met have forecast 100 mils for 2 days' time. So We start up harvesting that morning, just getting going into some wheat. The conditions are great. 6 tonne to the hectare crops. We've never been anywhere near that as a yield potential in our history as a business. Crops coming off at about 40 tonnes an hour. We're half an hour in though, and we have a breakdown. We've lost the hydraulics on one of the contractor's machines. It's broken a spline, which we found out after the fact was a known problem with that particular type of machine. Very, very quickly we scramble to see what's wrong and where the parts are. Parts will be 3 days away. So, 30 hours of harvest that we miss. What's the impact of that on our business? So, we lost a tonne to the hectare in yield from weather damage. The grain that we were harvesting pre-rain was now trading, had gone from $250 a tonne pre-rain to $320 a tonne post-rain. And the grain that was still in the paddock that we were yet to harvest was trading at about $160 a tonne. So, on the 200 hectares that we were unable to harvest, we've lost $224,000. So let's fast forward. Oh, no, while we're on that, sorry. That $224,000 is the profit, essentially. We still broke even on that crop, but that was the profit. So that's house renovations, that's new vehicles, that's CapEx to improve and make easier the functioning of our business, which then goes to the point about improving our standards of living, improving the quality of life for work of our farmers working in the business, and that's money that's cycling around our local economies, so that they're there prepared for the next drought as well, or the next downturn, because it doesn't need to be a drought. At the moment, we're living through a scenario where it's just so wet we can barely get onto our paddocks, and the crops are really suffering from it. So it's not just drought, it's also when it gets too wet. So we get really compressed windows when we really have opportunities to make good margin, but they're quite fleeting and we need to maximise them. So let's fast forward to last year. Again, another record year, growing some really great crops. The scenario this time was barley. 7.5 tonne to the hectare average, but we had another rainfall event, another 100, 150 mils for about a 2-week period. Well, there's a tonne and a half to the hectare. Feed grain, which is what we capture after rain, it's trading at about $220 a tonne, and malt grade is trading at about $320 a tonne. So now, but a harvester now can harvest 80 tonnes an hour. So what's the impact of that in real time now? So I'll take you back to the 2010 scenario. That 30 hours, at $224,000 we lost, that trades at about, that was $6,700 an hour lost every hour that machine wasn't working. And it is lost because it was there to capture. Now with modern machinery and in the right circumstance, a la last year when we've got good crops, but with good crops we also have wet seasons and wet harvests. It's all working against you, it seems sometimes. Our loss rate's north of $16,000 an hour. So you imagine in one day losing the average Canberra wage. And that's how I want you to think about this. Don't think about it in the context of my business's turnover. I want you to think about it in the context of your wage, because that's how I've got to live with it. That's how I've got to deal with that scenario, because I'm the last person to get paid, or the owners of the business, the last people to get paid. So yes, the businesses might look large and the turnover might look large, but the profit is right at the end and it's the hardest to capture. So moving forward, we're in a new environment now. We've got lots of electronic controllers in tractors and headers. They require, that electronic control makes functioning of the machine easier, but it also means that there are new sources of failure, and it makes diagnosing those machines much more difficult, because you've now got failure of the sensor and you've also got failure of the connective pathway between the sensor and the controller or the computer. So we'd have to do a lot of diagnostics in the paddock because there are an absence of technicians. They aren't freely available. In fact, machinery dealers at the moment are busier advertising for technicians to come and work with them than they are for me to go and buy their product. That's how rare they are. It's a real systematic crisis. So we've got such fragility in our system at the moment. We've got really limited windows to go and make profits. We've got a really challenging environment, which by all accounts seems to be getting more challenging. The business of farming has never got harder, but the tools that we can access, like I can't control the weather, but there is a tool that can allow me to get back in the paddock faster that I'm presently locked out of, and I can't get access to. So in order for a corporate monopoly to continue to build new moats around its monopoly, they're coming at the expense of myself, my industry, and my community more broadly, so that they can make a few more bucks just squeezing things just a bit harder, when there are orders of magnitude of benefit to the community and our industry that could come if only they would give us the opportunity to use them. So I'm going to wrap it up there because I really would appreciate some questions on this, but I'd like to thank you all for your time. I hope I've imparted the importance of this. I feel a real sense of obligation in this space because the magnitude of what we're talking about here in my sector is non-trivial. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We have time now for questions. I'm going to hand over to John Gutsakis from E-Waste Watch to handle the Slido questions. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Leanne. There's a swag of questions, so if you can be, so we can get to the three of you, if you can be concise with the responses. I'll go right back to the beginning and in relation to your presentation, Leslie. There's a question here from Matthew. With the TAFE course, is that for all EVs or each model specifically?
No, it's just one generic EV course or equivalent.
Right. Another question in relation to EVs. Voltages present legally can only be operated on by electricians. Does the TAFE course that you mentioned, does that overcome that hurdle or those requirements, or is it...
Sorry, John, what was the beginning of that question? That high voltage can only be worked on by electricians?
Yes.
That's not the case for vehicles.
Right.
No.
Okay.
There's a small anomaly in Queensland for heavy vehicles, but no. Professional automotive technicians service EVs, not electricians.
Okay. A question from Karen and Daniela from Mended IT Australia, and a question for you, Leslie. Has AAA had feedback from those keen DIY accomplished car repairers that they can't access the data from dealers, like in the US for $30 a day? So I think the question there is around, again, self-repair at a domestic level.
No response from DIY as yet. I expect that wave will come.
Okay, time to come. A question from Matthew. Is ASRA keeping notes of all the conflicts, errors, etc., and making them public so we can learn from any mistakes?
Yeah, we are keeping note and we will be publishing a report.
And maybe one more for you, Leslie, before we move on to Mark and Frank. A question from Kirsty Young from Sea Change. What have been the practical productivity benefits since the motor vehicle and service repair legislation came in? Any indications there around the benefits as a result to date?
Look, two, I think, knowing where to find it, so not hunting around. And the second one is just sheer productivity improvements from getting the right answer first. Getting the correct information straight away.
Sure. A question to whoever is in a position to respond to this one, again from Mended Australia for discussion. If farmers want to self-repair their tractors, harvesters, why the difference with self-repair under the mandatory automobile scheme? Anyone care to have a go at that one?
Look, I think that is... We were talking last night about how easy is it going to be to put agricultural machinery into the current law. And I think there are some complexities, and one of those is that farmers want to make adjustments to their machinery. And currently, the law is not set up for me as a car owner to be able to make modifications to the vehicle. So I think it's a discussion we would have to have if we're going to have a policy debate about incorporating ag into the law.
Okay.
I agree it's a complexity.
Sure. Again, a question to either of you. A question from Les Kitchen. If dealers mislead about warranty rights, are they liable for action as engaging in deceptive and misleading conduct?
You bet your sweet bippy they are.
I suppose the challenge, though, is being able to call them out. You know, like I said, when I was speaking, is that the misperception or misconception they're passing on to their consumers is they run off it and say, yep, okay, that's law, and they just follow it, where we have to step in and say, hey, that's not right. There's consequences for that action or that misinformation.
Yeah, I think we've got a big job to do here. And I think what we say to all of our customers is get that in writing. Get them to drop you an email. And all of a sudden, those problems go away.
There's an interesting question here from Anonymous that I think has relevance across the range of legislation and regulatory instruments. And the question is, are all aspects of enacting the legislation funded by government, or is there reliance on other funds, cost recovery, so on and so forth? Any comment there?
That's a very interesting question. So there is a fee to register with ASRA. So about 1,000 technicians have already done so, and those rates that I put up are providing an income. For onboarding each of the car manufacturers, they've also paid a fee to do that, $15,000 per manufacturer. So there is income coming from providing a service to the car makers and providing a service to the technicians. So there is income stream coming in. But there has been a significant cost in building a system from the ground up. And there was a small government grant that incentivised that. But I think the board of that new body does have a view about how its ongoing operation in terms of the IT infrastructure can be funded. So a bit of a yes, but no.
Can I just go? Back to the point about where do we land with the dealers in their space? It's very hard to convince someone of something when their wage depends on them not agreeing with it. Like, if there's not a financial problem, disincentive for them to maintain the status quo, i.e. fines, it just won't happen. And if it's not then communicated to the customer, it just doesn't get out. No one knows that it's going on, and that's where the challenge will really be.
A question from me, and more so for Mark and Frank. To what extent are your respective peak bodies and industry associations, whether it's in cropping, in cane growers, to what extent are the peak bodies and the associations over this issue, understand it, advocating, representing members, etc.? So how would you describe, maybe starting with you, Frank, where's cane growers at in appreciating the significance of repair, right to repair?
Well, we feel it's very important, and that's why I'm here today, and that's why I made a submission to the ACCC and the Productivity Commission, because, I suppose what we've got to look at, and what Mark spoke about, what makes it down to the profit line isn't really much at the end of the day. The top line looks fantastic, but when you wash it through everything else, and this is one of those components that is a cost, a direct cost that you can't avoid. And, just like fuel is elevated at the moment, just like fertiliser or input costs, this is one of those major components. Machinery is in the top 3 expense of running a farm, including repair and maintenance. So, being able to get the right to repair and to be able to execute it in the correct manner is very important to us as a representative organisation and to our farmers and contractors.
I am stepping into this space. I came from ag politics once upon a time, for all my sins, and I think an appreciation here, if there is an absence of presence from our state farming organisations and the NFF, I look at the quantum that they have to be across. This is one space. I contend it's an important space, but when you're dealing with biosecurity in the forms of foot and mouth, things like that at the moment, you've got labour shortages and issues around that space. There are tax implications. And to be frank, we just came out of a pretty horrendous drought, and we're now wandering into some pretty challenging times with a particularly wet season on the east coast. So, being across that when there are, whole sectors of government for that. The average ag politician is probably outnumbered in DAF by about 100 to 1. in terms of the resource that can come back at it. So how do you then compete against that, let alone the single interest groups? And if I'm a machinery manufacturer and I'm busy lobbying, you know, how many times can the farming organisations with their, you know, total remit of responsibility actually be in front of all of these spaces?
No, fair point. Another question from me, if I may, one for you, Leslie. In terms of the motor vehicle focus and all of this work done on developing legislation and the rules, the regs, do you see that as the basis or a platform for other product types? You know, do you think it would require much adjustment to look at how that whole approach more or less applies to furniture, to electronics, to other areas?
Look, I think the architecture is there. The fact that you need to have legislation that is principle-based, that is the why, that establishes clearly this is about fair and open competition, that is the what and to whom. I think it's got all of those elements. You need to have some operationalising arm. You need to have some ability to get the information. How does that transference occur? So I think on the one hand, it's certainly been written for the idiosyncrasies of an automotive sector. But I think if you strip out auto, what you're left with is a blueprint for how it can possibly work. Now, we're only a month in, so I don't know whether I'm going to say that in 12 months. But it'll be interesting to see how it rolls out. And you know what, I don't know how well it's adapted for other sectors, but gee, that's a policy debate I'd love to have.
Guido, did you have a question? No. There's a question here, anonymous. Does the law address car manufacturers restricting compatibility of spare parts? And if not, how do you see this being addressed in future?
Right, so the requirement under parts is that your warranty will be maintained if you use fit-for-purpose parts fitted by suitably qualified individuals. So as long as you've got fit-for-purpose and suitably qualified. And parts are made not necessarily by the car manufacturer, in fact rarely by them. They're made by third-party suppliers, and there is often a box labelled car manufacturer label and a box labelled Dayco, Ryco, you know. But so you often find there are equivalent parts. They're actually made by the same producer. Then there are generic parts for high volume replacement. And yes, I think there is a gap in the law in the sense that are you designing a system where we can't make generic parts? But the Designs Act does give you an exemption to make those. We're just not seeing those barriers to any great degree. I think the parts issue is much more about you can't buy the little hinge, you got to buy the whole unit. That's the parts thing that I'm watching at the moment that I think is a barrier to consumers and drives up cost. Can't get that bit, it's embedded in that bit.
Can I chime in from an agricultural perspective? There seems to be very much a trend towards bespoke parts that might be made by exactly the same manufacturer, but there is one bolt hole that you require that isn't on the generic, or there is one insert or whatever it is that makes it not fit for purpose when you start using the generic. And it's almost like it's a challenge to see who can find the factory full of extinct Inuit that no longer make this part. They are the only source and supply that there is. It's really becoming quite challenging, which might work if you're in Europe and you're 50 k's from a parts hub. But there are each of the brands would probably have 1 to 2 parts hubs on either side of the country. And if it's not there, you got to fly it in.
A question from Wayne. Case and JD were mentioned as being difficult to repair and even get technicians. Do farmers have any real alternatives, or do they all follow the same trend?
Well, I could think of other examples where exactly the same, you know, I mean, for example, JCBs, you've got to go through the dealer for that too. So there is plenty of other manufacturers that have followed the same path. That's probably where we're at in this modern age is with new machinery, is they're just quarantining it to their own dealer. I don't know if you've got any examples that go outside that, but it's pretty hard to find.
It really depends on the part. You know, we've repurposed tie rod ends from trucks to come onto tractors so that we can continue to keep going. It was an example I was going to run, but I didn't think I had time for it. but you've got to be quite creative in that space. There's some stuff you just can't get around though. If it spins or if it's got bolt holes or or cast in particular. But now when we get into the electronic space, is the control module got the correct software? Is it unlocked? That's the new space we're heading to.
Yeah, and that's probably what I'm referring to more, is that electronic space, is that when you've got a controller on it, like I said with my example before about the valves, you can find something that fit there, but you can't control it because you can't plug it in, so it's not compatible in that sense. And that's the challenge. They're designing these pieces of electronics or controls that can only be operated with their software.
I'll probably add, I don't think it's nefarious. I think it's just profit motive and not really seeing the bigger picture and how that impacts people. As I say, in a European or a North American context where a lot of this comes out of, it's probably not a massive cost of doing business. In a remote, sparsely populated country like Australia, where there is an absence of technicians and there's, spare parts are rare, it's business limiting at that point. And I just think it's apathy about not understanding the context more so than people really wanting to flex their monopolistic muscles.
A question here from Bernard Porter. Can the information provided be used to adjust or remove unnecessary or inefficient features included by the maker or the manufacturer? For example, pointless beeping.
That's probably a question about the ADAS systems, the lane departure warnings, the fact that when you step into a new car, it just consistently beeps at you. That is certainly a feature of the car industry needs to have a conversation about, because it is tempting consumers to turn it off or to ask our technicians to turn it off. Australian law for ADAS currently only mandates the introduction of emergency braking, so lane departure is not an Australian design requirement yet. Look, our mechanics would not take the vehicle out of spec, is my official position, John.
Can I jump in there, sorry, just with regard to, again, the context of manipulation around machinery. So one of the more fragile components that's coming in now on modern machinery, and it's in the truck space as well, is the emissions stuff, particularly around AdBlue. AdBlue, don't get me wrong, I understand its point and purpose. I don't have a problem with that. But my machine can be completely functional, and I have a sensor issue or I have an AdBlue problem. AdBlue ages quite quickly, so if you've got something that's only pulled out once every 12 months and you have a problem, it's settled out or it's decomposed in the tank, and you're ready to go and start harvesting your crop and you can't go and you've got a fully functional machine outside the fact that your emissions reduction tools aren't working, that's a really serious problem. And it's not that I don't want it to work, but we want to talk about business limiting stuff that's meaningful. I would argue that the loss of the yield potential on that crop is as important, if not more important, than the marginal benefit from that one machine having a functioning AdBlue system. But it'll put you into limp mode and you're no longer fit for purpose.
Not so much a question here, but a comment from Matthew, which I think is interesting. The way Mark and Frank are describing proprietary parts sounds like the way printer manufacturers tried to embed chips into printer cartridges. So again, more of a comment there. A question for Mark and Frank in particular. Given that there is so much discussion and action and reporting from big companies around CSR and ESG and these bigger picture areas around sustainability and what you've both said around impact on communities, on family businesses, do you think some of these big manufacturers are sort of living true to their annual sustainability reports about ESG and CSR in relation to the very issues you're talking about?
I was going to put in my introduction that I'm the most opinionated overthinker that you'll meet here today.
Cut loose, Mark.
I think it rings hollow. I think it's, at the boardroom, I think the engagement in that space is quite shallow, would be the way I would describe it. Because it seems to be, how can we advertise that we're doing good, which might be great from a PR perspective, but there doesn't seem to be the action to actually understand their impacts of their current business models and how they impact broader society. And if ESG has a space, it is really how they have the maximum positive impact at societal level. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not going to be absent profit motive, but it just doesn't seem to have a lot of thought into the complexities of what ESG actually means at a broader societal level.
I mean, that was the point of my question, is that there often seems to be a big schism between, you know, that end of sustainability reporting and what businesses are putting out there, and in many cases it's legitimate and valid. But this is a very practical space in terms of translating those big goals into supporting you to do what you need to do at a, you know, with the strong social dimension and environmental benefit, etc. So,
Just one little comment I'll add in is I don't believe at that higher end or upper end those large organisations actually are in touch with the smaller communities, the rural communities. They're very much removed from it. You know, if we probably saw them that they wanted to be involved, then they would come down to our agriculture centres, to this conference and whatever be more involved in what's actually happening in the local communities, in the rural communities, and how the agricultural industries in those local communities are the heartbeat of those local communities. And if you took sugar out of the Herbert River, we wouldn't have a local community. All the shops would close, the schools would be empty. So there's such a, you know, the agriculture is such a heartbeat, and I don't think they really, not that they could easily understand that it's been involved and not been so removed from practicality of life in a rural community.
I'm going to add to that, and I think that there's a big chunk of people even adjacent to or near those communities who actually don't understand that Australia, well, inland Australia, would be a series of mining camps, absent agriculture. And we see it in the regulations that come forth that, you know, we have not fit for purpose transport laws, that, you know, there would be no one on the roads. There would not be roads were it not for agriculture. But the impost on those is quite significant from those rules. So, look, I guess where I want to leave it on this one is, if there are some large companies who want to actually have a conversation about what that ESG might look like in relation to what we've talked about here today, I'm all ears. I'll have that conversation and say, look, let's have a go at it.
thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent session, and I, having worked in agriculture on the IP issues for a long time, I love to hear your stories. So I thank you both very much, Mark and Frank, for sharing your stories. And to you, Leslie, thank you again for giving us insight into our first right to repair law. Can you please join with me in thanking all the speakers?